We are in something of a femcel spring. And yet, it seems no one can agree on what they even are, or if they even exist. The past few years have seen interest in this shadowy cabal grow quite steadily, and while still thoroughly eclipsed by interest in incels, the rising focus on this group seems to be completely independent of any focus on incels. You might ponder, that is strange, for they are all just incels. Why should their popularity change depending on gender? And in that you would strike on an interesting issue. You will find that these two groups are seemingly completely separate things. Femcels are not just female incels. So then, what are they? Currently, this is a very difficult question to answer as the word femcel is thrown around quite flippantly and can mean many different things, often quite separated from inceldom. This is confusing. Like if someone came to you and said, "I am a National Socialist," and then you found out that their politics had nothing to do with socialism and a lot to do with hating Jews. If we seek the guidance of the Wiktionary, it tells us that femcels are defined as a woman associated with and or adjacent to the incel aesthetic, vibe, or other connotations. What the fuck does that mean? Weirdly enough, this is actually a fairly good definition, as in its vagueness it captures roughly all the groups that you could define as femcels. But this isn't enough for me. It disgusts me. When you say the word incel, everyone knows what you mean. I crave the strength and the certainty of such a definition, and so I take this task upon myself. I will assemble a definition, and then look to all those who are called femcel and weigh their claim to the title, so we can answer. To some of the audience, it may not be clear why this question has to be asked. You may say, if people call themselves femcels, and those people do exist, then clearly, femcels are real. What you would be missing is that inceldom is a profoundly male experience in its every fiber, and so whether this experience can even exist in a female context is hotly debated by femcels, incels, and normal people alike. For us to figure out if femcels are real, there are two other questions that must be answered in reverse order for us to get there. The first is, what does it mean to make something female? And the second is, what is an incel? You. The reasons for answering this question are obvious. If we are to know what a femcel is, we need to be very sure of what an incel is. This in itself is a problem because incels, much like femcels, are freak fuck weirdos and make themselves very hard to define. I will thus be answering this question quite thoroughly so that you, the viewer, can get a very strong idea of what an incel is and is not before we abstract it to a female context. Incels are very fond of creating new words to describe their unique plight, so at many points during this video I'm going to be speaking in fluent black pill true cell dialect in order to keep things simple. If you ever need re-clarification of one of these words, there will be a glossary at this timestamp. Definitionally, incel is simply a shortening of involuntary celibate, meaning someone who is unable to engage in sexual relations with other people for reasons outside of their control. And in some communities, being an incel is defined as just this, an unfortunate life circumstance. Much as a homeless person is currently without a home, an incel is currently without sex. But neither homelessness nor inceldom is actually a part of the person's identity. This is clearly not a useful nor honest definition of the group that is known as incels. If you decided that today you would like to have sex and for whatever reason you are unable to attain it, you are for that period, however long it is, an involuntary celibate. But you are obviously not an incel. Most people could roughly define what they think an incel is, and clearly someone who simply failed to woohoo yesterday would not be one. On the opposite end of this, many people tend to overcorrect by labeling any man who generates any uncomfortable discourse on the topics of gender, sex, or dating as an incel. This is also not useful. Just because a man is upset that he cannot find love does not make him an incel. Similarly, just because a man is a misogynist also does not make him an incel. As I will explain, inceldom is a complex ideology with very specific beliefs. So if it's not just about involuntary celibacy or being a virgin with rage, what does make someone an incel? I will argue that inceldom has two component parts. The first being a belief in the red pill. The term red pill refers to a broad range of ideologies that generally suggest that the common conception of our world is in some way false. This can take many forms, being centered on the large web of right-wing conspiratorial beliefs. Calling someone red-pilled is thus a slightly vague statement, as it could suggest all manner of beliefs. You may be red-pilled on having sex with dogs. However, the most common form of red pill, and the one that most people are referring to when they use the term, is being red-pilled on gender and dating. This is the red pill swallowed by incels and what I am referring to when I use the word. This red pill outlines that contemporary society is set up to prioritize the needs of women and a number of minority groups at the cost of the desires of the vast majority of men. In swallowing this red pill, you accept that dating is a deeply hierarchical system, dominated by those who present the greatest value in achievement, appearance, race, and personality. If an individual is to succeed, they must either naturally excel in these areas or alter themselves in some way so that they can. With these beliefs also follows a broad belief that women are dull, shallow creatures that only desire aggressive, successful alpha men. Thus, followers of this ideology believe that gender and dating ought to be viewed as a kind of game where women's histrionic behaviors must be learned if they are to be tamed, and that an individual must eliminate all of their negative traits, particularly those in their appearance, in order to maximize success. This focus on maximizing a positive physical appearance gives rise to a concept called looks maxing. Looks maxing is obviously maximizing one's looks. Primarily centered around the looksmax.org forum, looksmaxers hope to excel in the dating game by becoming a physically perfect specimen. Looksmaxers, like incels, are a highly methodological and categorical group. In order to looksmax, an individual must critically analyze their appearance, studying their facial structure, the clarity of their skin, the thickness of their hair, and so on, and then adopt a series of designations which outline where they are failing. If you are balding, you are a bald cell, and therefore you must take drugs or undergo surgery to fix this. This is called hair maxing. If you hail from the South Asian subcontinent, you are a curry cell, and thus should alter your appearance in order to appear more European. This is white maxing. If you are short, you are a manlet, and should probably kill yourself because you are NGMI. You get the picture. From the looksmaxer's perspective, one ought to achieve the appearance of Chad or die trying. One part of the looksmaxing doctrine that is important in understanding the incel mindset is the PSL ranking system. PSL is the name of a community meaning poorhate.com, sluthate.com, lookism.com, the name of 3 prominent red pill forums. The PSL rating system is a scale devised by these forums members upon which we can rank human attractiveness, scaling from 0 to 8. 0 is the bottom of the scale, the very worst appearance a human being could possibly have. Scores close to 0 are typically reserved for people with disabilities, deformities, injuries, and so on. An example they give for someone close to 0 is Joseph Merrick. On the other end of the scale is 8, which is the upper limit of human beauty. Much as no one is absolute 0, there is also no one alive who is a perfect 8. An example of a high 7 is Hernan Drago, who is commended for his extremely masculine appearance, wide angular jaw, positive canthal tilt, hunter eyes, thick hair, and so on. When you are physically superior to someone else, it is called mogging. Hernan moggs in almost every department. To incels, one's physical appearance is important, not only for its effects on dating, but also because it defines whether or not you can claim to be an incel. This is a topic of hot debate in incel communities as they are by their nature exclusionary. Incels define themselves by what they lack, so if you do not lack enough, you must surely not be an incel. Now in practice this does logically make sense. If Hernan Drago, a 7.5 PSL, height-mogging, face-mogging Chad, were to stumble into an incel forum and declare that he was a KHV and NGMI, the other users would go, "This is entirely your own fault. You have everything that you need to succeed." Hernan would thus be dubbed a fake cell, someone who is claiming inceldom despite being fully able to attain a relationship. This, in turn, gives rise to the concept of a true cell, where the fake cell's celibacy is entirely under their own control, and the average incel perhaps has some room to improve and thus cease being celibate. The true cell is doomed. Fate has dealt them the absolute worst of hands, and no matter their efforts, they could not alter the flawed parts of their person in any way that would bring success. From the true cell's perspective, all non-true cells are complaining about things that they are choosing to suffer from. To wrap up the explanation of the important cell varieties, I will quickly explain the near cell. Near cells are like incels in every way, just ever so slightly better. They have low to average income, they are lower on the PSL scale, and while they could have sex, they can't be profoundly picky about their partners. To you, near cells may seem like the incel's way of describing the average person. Makes you think, doesn't it? The final piece in understanding the incel red pill is the catalogue of other pills that one could swallow. Much as there are thousands of maxings and cells and so on, incels like to describe the acceptance of certain lifestyles as pills. For example, those who do not believe in the red pill are blue-pilled. However, the only other pill that I have to explain is the black pill. This pill represents doom, a disastrous circumstance for which there is no solution at all. Like the red-pilled, the black-pilled see through the lies of the world, but find that the system is totally rigged against them and that there is no path to success. True cells are black-pilled, as they see their inceldom as totally incurable. This is the end of my explanation of red pill ideology, the first half of what I believe to be the fundamental pieces of an incel. In order to introduce the second half of inceldom, I will ask and answer. Andrew Tate is inarguably red-pilled in an almost identical way to most incels. He shares their beliefs about women, masculinity, dating hierarchies, and so on, but clearly Andrew Tate is not an incel. Why not? Because he does not share their sexual frustration. Now, it will probably be universally argued that the sexual frustration of incels stems from their lack of sex or lack of romance, but I completely disagree. I would contend that their sexual frustration actually comes from them lacking the kind of sexual and romantic attention that they desire, and I think you will agree. For example, if an incel were to purchase the services of a sex worker, they would then no longer be celibate. But would they then cease to be an incel? Your answer should be no. There is nothing about this interaction that would cure their problems. Most of them would come out in an identical state. If anything, this would probably only reinforce their beliefs that society has taken away the conventional means by which men acquire sex, forcing them to acquire it monetarily. And you would struggle to find an incel who would disagree with this notion. Many incels have access to the capital required to solicit a sex worker, but they remain untempted and uncured. It is simply not the kind of sex that they want. They want to be desired. But then let's say we could make them desired. Hypothetically, maybe the government could give out state-sponsored girlfriends willing to engage in sexual and romantic relationships with these incels. But let's also say that they were only PSL2. They would again not be cured, because this is not the kind of relationship that they want. Because they are red-pilled to the true nature of how things should be, they think they deserve more than a PSL2. Therefore, being desired by a PSL2 is not the kind of desire that they want. From these two examples, we can see quite clearly that inceldom is not about not having sex or not having romance, but instead, quite importantly, about not having the variety of these things that the incel wants. This is what separates the average red pillar from the incel. Andrew Tate gets all the sex and attention that he wants from women, and he gets it in the forms that he desires. The incel does not. Thus, from this, we complete my definition of an incel: a red-pilled, heterosexual man that is not getting the kind of sexual and romantic attention that they desire and believe they deserve. Now, this definition would no doubt be rejected by card-carrying incels, but this is no great achievement, for incels are truly terrible at defining themselves, as they completely lack self-awareness, and my definition is completely centered around a mindset. In order to demonstrate this to you, I will explain to you the 5'2" balding Indian janitor. The 5'2" balding Indian janitor is a concept used by some incels to describe the concept of a true cell in an easily understandable format for normies. To incels, this individual, due to his height, race, appearance, and career, is an utterly lost cause. There is nothing he could do to make himself desirable, and therefore he is a true cell. But clearly to us, the blue-pilled masses, they are wrong. I would not be so naive to suggest that this man could just waltz onto Tinder and attain a biracial slam piece like that, but clearly he is not completely and utterly unlovable. There is someone out there for the 5'2" balding Indian janitor. If you do not believe me, you should go outside and you will find that a lot of low-value, low PSL individuals have families and children and so on. And thus the idea of the truest, most real incel, as defined by incels, falls to pieces. Therefore, I am happy to work with a definition that most incels would disagree with, because most incels cannot interface with reality. Being a 5'2" balding Indian janitor does not make you an incel, but believing that it must, does. Under my definition, you would also include a lot of so-called fake cells, or even people who are in relationships, but hopefully I have demonstrated why that is okay. There are many people who express profoundly incel-like behaviors while being in sexual relationships, and many people who behave completely unlike incels while lacking all of these things. Contrary to what incels would declare, inceldom is entirely about a mindset and has nothing to do with the things you lack. With this definition in hand, we can now move on to the second question that must be answered to know if femcels are real. What does it mean to make something female? Or,
how do we put a fem in femcel?
Inceldom is in all ways a fundamentally male movement. Their reasons for thinking the way that they do are inextricably linked to the male experience. It is a movement about dating as a man, perceiving women as a man, reconciling with one's own masculinity, and so on. These are not things that can just be swapped to the other gender without changing quite significantly. Thus, it is not entirely clear how one might approach transposing the definition of incel across into a female form. I don't think any one approach is more right than any other, so I'm just going to explain the primary ways that I think this could be approached before we move on. The obvious method would be swapping out man for woman. This is very clean. Clearly, this would signal female incel in the most direct way. But there is an argument to be made that this is an unrealistic way of imagining the situation. For example, take a subculture, let's say gyaru. If we set out to make male gyaru, would we just take a man and adorn him head to toe in the kind of clothes that you would expect the average gyaru to wear and then call this male gyaru? No, that would just be dressing up a man in gyaru. There is nothing male about it. If you wanted to make a male equivalent, you would take the ideas of gyaru and alter them to fit the male cultural context in the same way that they fit the female cultural context. And this is a real thing called gyaruo. In this same way, I think simply changing male to female in the incel definition does not account for the necessary alterations that have to be made to make something fit in a female context. So then, what else could we change about the definition to make it work better? What about the red pill? This is a concept explored by femcels and incels alike, and has led to the conception of yet another pill called the pink pill. We can vaguely imagine the pink pill as a similar rejection of the blue pill, an angst towards a world that is lying to women about what is expected of them in the realms of romance, dating, and sex. Perhaps where the red pill leaves its adherents feeling lied to on the importance of subjects like height in a dating context, the pink pill might place similar weight on the importance of having clear skin. And perhaps, for you, this makes the definition work better. Another suggestion that I would propose for this change in definition is that maybe it's better to view femcels as something entirely different. It occasionally occurs within subcultural groups that men and women will display their engagement with that culture in wildly different ways. A good example of this is hip-hop. Female rappers and male rappers are, on average, very different. They do not rap about the same things, they do not wear the same clothes, they do not have the same fans, but it is all hip-hop. They share enough attributes that we all accept that they are doing the same thing, just in wildly different gendered forms. And in this same way, perhaps, femceldom and inceldom are only related in vague ways. There are numerous other ways we could slice this issue, but whether or not you agree with one of these ways more than any other is not super important. I only presented these hypothetical situations to you to exhibit the ways which we could look at the issue to prime you for when we do try to answer the question, are femcels real? So now, let's do that. Now that you understand the theoretical routes by which we could approach the issue, I will illustrate to you the reality, which is far more horrific and completely impossible to decipher. Let's have a look at the word femcel as it's used around the internet. Here we have a meme depicting a so-called femcel sleepover. I'm not familiar with all of these characters, but I know a few of them, so let's analyze them. First, Ray. Why is she a femcel? I guess she's awkward. Okay, what about Asuka, who almost behaves completely the opposite of Ray? Well, I suppose she's kind of mean. What about Lane? Well, she uses the internet, but she's also just kind of awkward. And she's 14. Okay, maybe that's all just random bullshit. What about this TikTok user, a self-styled average femcel? Well, apparently she has a roster, meaning multiple potential romantic partners, and she just kind of makes relatable comedy posts. So, all of these people are called femcels. And why? Well, I suppose they all kind of look similar. What about this? True femcel bingo. Maybe this can show us the through line of how all these people are linked. Well, if you look at the options, they do paint a picture of a thoroughly mentally unwell person, which I suppose is kind of incel-like, but how does that relate to any of this other shit? The answer is, it doesn't. What femcel means to one person will almost certainly mean something completely different to anyone else. Unlike incels, there is no organized identity or mutual experience of femceldom. It's just pure mimetic nonsense, with some tangential relation to inceldom. However, within the nonsense, there are some prevailing ideas of how a femcel can be identified. So, I am going to present all of the groups to you, and hopefully, somewhere in that mess, one of the groups feels like real femcels. Hopefully. Right off the bat, I will clarify that most of these people are not going to be experiencing celibacy in the form described by incels. The female experience of sex and dating is simply not comparable to the male one. It seems to me that most of these women identify with celibacy more as a frustration towards the worlds of dating and sex, not just a clear-cut inability to have sex as experienced by the incel. Yes, they probably could have sex if they tried, but this doesn't mean it is by any means ideal nor desirable to them. In incel terms, these kind of people are called mental cells, as their inceldom comes from a kind of inward mental barrier rather than a rejection by the world. If you are the kind of person that looks at this and goes, "That's not real involuntary celibacy, any woman could get sex if they just tried," then I'm sorry, my friend, but the bus stops here. For you, femcels are not real. But for those of you who are willing to try and understand femceldom as an experience related to inceldom, but not entirely similar, we will continue and examine all those who are called femcel. The first group I will look at, I will simply call the female involuntary celibate. Much as an incel could be described as simply a person existing in a state of involuntary celibacy, some argue that a femcel is simply a woman existing in a state of involuntary celibacy. Thus, any woman who is not currently having sex while wanting to would be a femcel. As with describing incels in this way, it is stupid. The next group is the understanding of femceldom as described by incels. Thus, I will call them femcels as defined by incels. Incels believe that their plight centers around the fact that they cannot have sex. They also believe that any woman could find sex if they wanted to. Thus, incels believe that most people claiming to be a femcel would, in effect, be fake cells, as they are not doomed to celibacy. Or that they are just voluntary celibates, or volcels, who are too picky. In order for a femcel to be the equivalent of a true cell, a true femcel, so to speak, some incels believe that she must hold some characteristic that makes her completely undesirable in sex and romance. Most commonly, they argue that being extremely disfigured would be grounds to call oneself a femcel. This is ludicrous, in the same way that it is ludicrous to call the 5'2" balding Indian janitor a true cell. It requires that you view dating as a game of looks, and only looks, and that if you don't look good, you cannot date. Clearly, this is a misshapen understanding of the world and not a good faith attempt at diagnosing femceldom. The most well-known and likely most populous group of so-called femcels could be described as sort of aesthetic femcels. If you are to be familiar with any kind of femcel, it is likely this kind. Frequently found on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, this group are identifiable mostly by an appearance. A look defined by large, dark-framed glasses, long dark hair, sometimes an unkempt appearance, all kind of building to make a kind of implied ugliness in its pieces, but they are always conventionally attractive. This is commonly referred to as the femcel phenotype. They are oft nerdy, otaku, autistic, or just generally weird, with hobbies that are considered outside of the feminine or generally uncommon among girls, like locomotives or racism. However, this can describe an awful lot of people and an awful lot of interests, and thus, other than sharing this aesthetic, the people who are described as femcels in this way can vary pretty thoroughly. Thus, I have split this group into its three most consistent characterizations. The first among them I'm calling the orbital aesthetic femcels. If you ever find yourself in an incel or incel-adjacent community, let's say the R9K board on 4chan or the more dire ends of your Instagram algorithm, you may find some women who align with this description. In behavior, they are incel-like, being highly online, interested in Japanese cultural products. They have a sort of implied dirtiness, like they don't shower. Probably true. And they sometimes exhibit racism, homophobia, and so on. A lot of the time she is seemingly red-pilled, but she will always have an appearance and set of interests that attract incels. As a consequence, she is often able to garner something of a following, a group of highly online young men who orbit her. Ultimately, I think what makes people want to call women like this femcels is that they have a following of incel-like men. They are women surrounded by inceldom. However, to me, this feels more like a costume than an identity. It is a very, very small group of people using incel ideas and imagery to get something they want. Thus, I don't see this as a very valid expression of femceldom. There is no actual idea of a femcel self here, just a feminine image made to attract an incel audience. The second of the aesthetic femcels is the antisocial aesthetic femcel. This group is fairly similar to the orbital, but is a much more popular understanding of the term femcel. Once again, they have all of the physical hallmarks of the aesthetic femcel, but their trait that makes them feel like a femcel is of course their antisocial behavior. Psychopathy, narcissism, a general propensity for crime, things like this are this group's defining feature. Thus, it should be no surprise that these women are best known for their mugshots, which are often the subject of a trending "I could fix her" sort of fascination. This kind of personality, paired with the signature femcel look, is enough to make this definition work for most people, and I'll agree it does feel right. Incels are antisocial internet men. These are antisocial women with a popular internet aesthetic. However, with some deeper examination, it does not really work. Firstly, the kind of antisocial behavior that this group is known for, while present among some incels, is really not the kind of antisocial behavior that we know incels for. This group is often highly manipulative, chaotic, and outwardly destructive to the world, something that's relatively uncommon among the rather inwardly focused incels. Further, nothing about this group suggests a clear sexual angst. While some of this group are known for having perversions, they are clearly communing with sexuality in a completely different way to incels. And finally, most people you find in this group could not be described as overly online. So, while I agree that this group does feel right, I don't think that they are really a female equivalent to incels in any technical way. They are femcels in vibe alone, but maybe that works for you. The final of the aesthetic femcels I will call just aesthetic femcels. They are femcels in aesthetic only. It was inevitable that the two former groups, becoming the subject of popular trends here and there, would leak into the world of normies in some way. Sometimes memes are created that separate out some of the edgier elements of the incel personality, leaving the femcel to appear to just be a girl with those nerdy, otaku, or autistic personality traits, paired with the established femcel aesthetic. Additionally, regardless of any connection to this subculture, this leads people to labeling things as femcel just because they share this aesthetic. And naturally, a lot of people identify with this. Unaware that it might have some weird negative connotation, they see it and go, "She's just like me." These people share nothing with incels other than a very abstract set of connections through shared interests, and maybe looking a bit bedraggled. If you would like your definition for femcels to have a strong, logical connection to inceldom, this group is not the one for you. But if you would fancy femcels being a totally independent female subculture with its own values and interests, almost entirely conceptually separate from its male counterpart, and maybe wholly unrelated to the concept of celibacy, then maybe this works for you. A great deal of my understanding of the next 3 varieties of femcel comes from research previously conducted by the YouTuber Kidology. She has spoken extensively on the topic and has a lot of interesting videos that provide a deeper insight from a self-identifying femcel's perspective. I have most specifically drawn from this video. Next is the pink-pilled Redditor. In many ways, this group is an extremely close representation of incel behaviors among an organized association of women. They are mainly known for their informal organization across a couple of different subreddits. Most famously, True Femcels, Red Pill Women, Pink Pill Feminism, and Female Dating Strategy. Some of these subreddits remain, but this group, much like incels, are frequently deplatformed, so a lot of these communities no longer exist. These women have swallowed the previously mentioned pink pill. It broadly asserts that contemporary society is set up to prioritize the desires of men, and that a minority of beautiful women, through their looks, are able to gain some kind of advantage and use it to push down all other women. They hate men for not being what they want them to be, and they hate their fellow women for going along with or even benefiting from what they perceive to be an unjust world. Some of these women will even go so far as to direct hate towards trans women for adding competition to this already cutthroat attention economy. This feels very familiar. This pink pill is very similar to the red pill. They are hateful. They even make their own words. Like where incels use the word foid to derisively describe the women they detest, these women flip it around and call men moids. And like incels hate femcels, these femcels hate incels. Yes, they do date, but like incels, they have a hard time getting attention from anyone that they find high value, and so they rarely have an enjoyable experience doing so. So in this sense, they are not getting the kind of attention that they want. They are an almost perfect gender bend of inceldom. This makes a compelling case. This next group is rather fascinating as it is more of a historic expression of femcel identity. the black-pilled femcel. When the incel phenomenon was reaching its peak in popularity, there were a lot of women who said, "I understand how you feel." Contrary to incel doctrine, it is in reality very common that women are not able to get into relationships despite wanting to. These women were in some sense black-pilled. Much like a true cell, these women believed that their PSL score was too low, or they were just not born in the right context or with the right opportunities, and now they just can't get a date. They are seemingly doomed to a life without love. These women would agree with concepts like looksmaxing, as like incels, they wanted to not be this way. They wanted to find love and were willing to fix whatever may be wrong with themselves in order to achieve it. Thus, at the time, these women attempted to join incel communities, thinking they had a common cause. But they were rejected. The incels couldn't understand that their own issue was deeper than just a lack of sex, so they would say, "You could get sex from someone if you just tried. You are not like us." And so these women just disappeared out of the discourse. No allies to help them in their doom, rejected even by the rejects. You may wonder, why did they not just establish their own communities? This is a bit of a common problem among femcels. Almost none of the previously mentioned groups have a large public forum or website where they can connect. And those that do are frequently deplatformed and never really rebuild. The reasons why are potentially numerous and not really clear to me. For some reason, femcels just don't congregate like incels do. And so, in this case, when these women were rejected by the incel community, they had almost no community of their own to turn to, and so they just disappeared. The last group I will call mental femcels, and are perhaps the most honest attempt to intellectualize a real, experienced femcel identity. Mental cells are described as incels experiencing inceldom due to some mental blockade, like mental illness, social anxiety, a dissatisfaction with the world, and so on, instead of the conventional lack of good looks and personality. While many incels would call these people fake cells, there is an acceptance among some that mental celdom is a legitimate reason for involuntary celibacy. How then does this relate to femcels? Well, the dating market is currently difficult to navigate. A great portion of individuals desire hookups alone. A great portion of individuals can't be in a relationship without hurting themselves or their partner. A great portion of young people have very strange ideas about how sex should work. A lot of people just generally have a lot of issues. Thus, there are some people who look at this and go, "I do not know how to navigate the dating market, and even if I thought to try, I may get myself or someone else into more trouble than the trouble that I get from being single." Which is understandable. Oftentimes, dating is not clean nor simple. Yes, this hypothetical person could be forced to date, and in this way their celibacy is somewhat voluntary, but it's voluntary in the same way that I could voluntarily chop off my own arm. The choice is so untenable that it's hardly a choice at all. Thus, there are some women who label themselves as femcels due to this experience. They feel a connection to incels in that they similarly feel as though the world is not presenting them with a dating market that is going to operate in any way that benefits them. Now, most incels would reject someone who exists in this state, as it does not align with their understanding of why someone might be celibate. However, to me, and some incels, this does seem like a very legitimate form of inceldom, and one that would disproportionately affect women. Thus, I would be happy to call this a completely legitimate expression of inceldom operating in a female context. Those are all of my candidates. There are probably more variations that could be discussed, but I covered most of the understandings of the issue that I am familiar with. And there probably aren't many more that are profoundly different to any one that I discussed. So to answer the question, are femcels real? I would say yes. Correct. They are just one or multiple of these groups, and it is up to you to decide who they are. If you want my opinion, I would say that there are two ways of looking at it. If you want femcels to just be the female equivalent of incels, meaning an equally hateful group that operates and perceives the world in a very similar way, just from a female perspective, then clearly the pink-pilled Redditor is the best candidate. They are organized on forums, they make up their own language, they hate women, they hate men, they have a highly competitive way of looking at the world. Their behavior mirrors incels almost perfectly. They are a very direct inversion of inceldom expressed by women. However, if you want to look at femceldom as a uniquely female experience, a whole new identity separate but related to inceldom, then I'd either choose the just aesthetic femcels or the mental femcels. Both of these groups are women self-identifying as femcels because it seems to accurately describe some part of their lived experience. They mainly differ in how they connect to inceldom, with the aesthetic femcels being an offshoot of the aesthetic culture built by incels, less concerned with the celibacy part, and the mental femcels being an attempt to completely recontextualize the plight and sadness of the incel as a feminine experience. I am not a woman, so I cannot help you decide which of the two is most legitimate. And as far as I'm concerned, the rest of the groups are not worth considering at all. They are either non-existent, extremely niche, or just a totally bizarre way of approaching the idea of femceldom, and so I don't think any of them could give an affirmative answer to the question of this video. And that is all I have to say about that. This is the third ever video on this channel. If you enjoyed it, then I enjoy you. I would like to produce more content on this subject matter very soon. So subscribe if you would like to see more, or don't. Few do. But those who do have a very special place in my heart. See you.